Donald Trump is likely to return to the White House. Recent polls indicate that his victory is quite realistic later this year in the presidential elections in the US, and this quite naturally causes various reactions across the world, especially in those regions and countries where the US interests are widely present. But perhaps the major takeaway from his potential victory will be that his first presidency was not an aberration in the US foreign policy, in the US, in the shifting nature of the internal American politics, but rather, I wouldn't say a normalcy, but certainly a natural product of the past decades of US foreign policy in the Middle East, in other parts of the world. So it is quite clear that with his likely nomination as a presidential candidate and potential victory, his rule might be a rule setter essentially for the next presidents or administrations in the US. Obviously, it is very difficult to argue what exactly his presidency will look like in the foreign affairs, but what we can delineate for the moment is the shifting nature of the global geopolitical situation which we have in 2024 in comparison with 2016. So back then when Donald Trump was first elected, the world was a different one. The US was, as it is nowadays, still a paramount power, but it had fewer direct enemies, or I would say those enemies or those rivals were not as aggressive as they are nowadays. Well, first, relations with Iran back then were not that antagonistic. After all, Barack Obama managed to sign a major nuclear deal with the Islamic Republic of Iran, and overall the situation on the ground in the Middle East was more or less stable, except for the rise of ISIS and so on and so on. But when it comes to US-Iran relations or even US-Turkey relations, the situation on the ground was more or less acceptable. Then, of course, there was Russia. Russia back then was the country which just 2 years earlier occupied the Crimean Peninsula, part of Ukraine, also instigated a full-scale conflict in the eastern part of Ukraine, but nevertheless Russia was managed, so to say. Russian threat was not that overwhelming for Europe, for the US. And then, of course, there was a major problem for the United States. That was China. China is a rising power, rising economic powerhouse essentially, and also a military actor. Back then, the US still hesitated to name the China's rise essentially as a direct threat to the United States. So if we compare the basic geopolitical situation back then with what we've got now, with full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces, with more formidable China, with Iran, who tries to essentially limit US activity, U.S. military activity across the Middle East, and a few other actors across Eurasia and even in Africa and Latin America who are trying to reshape the global order, we see that the differences are stark, actually. And with the potential victory of Donald Trump, we might be seeing something extraordinary in the world affairs, essentially. Well, first of all, as I said in the beginning, this will no longer be seen as an aberration. Perhaps Trump is an indication that in the US foreign policy there is a trend towards essentially a transactional manner of foreign affairs. And this will be to the liking of many, actually, in the US and especially in most of the countries across the Eurasian continent, and especially in the liberal states or explicitly dictatorial countries. So for them, the liberal nature of the previous US presidents essentially is not acceptable. And with Trump, they hope that it will be very much possible to build a different type of bilateral relations, which will be devoid essentially of such issues as human rights, the level of democratic institutions, or democratization, essentially, whether it's in Africa, in Middle East, or elsewhere across the world. So for many, whether it's in Russia, China, even in Iran or other parts of the world, the transactional nature, potentially transactional nature of the Trump presidency will be a boon essentially for them. And it also might be argued that however lucky they might be, for example, Russia or other actors across Eurasia having a transactional presidency in the US, they still will be facing a highly, I would say, chaotic US administration, which is both good but also bad, because it will be very unorganized in a way, and chaotic, unorganized, and unpredictable. So in a way, the competition between the US and other actors across Eurasia, such as Russia, China, Iran, and small actors, will be much more intensified, much more intense than it had been before. So that will be perhaps the second potentially second major takeaway from his second presidency, essentially. So with Trump, we might be actually seeing a major shift taking place in the US foreign policy, which even after he is gone, future American presidents are actually quite likely to pursue foreign policy devoid of issues of such as human rights and democratization. So that will bring more agility to Trump's foreign policy and to other into future presidencies, I would say. So that's yet another major expectation from his potential rule if he wins in the elections later this year. So, but nevertheless, the US, I would say, retrenchment from alliances, from partners and other actors across Eurasia will send essentially shocking waves across the continent, and US allies and partners will be questioning how actually able or willing the US is to defend them in case of major escalation. And that will perhaps take place throughout his potential second term, essentially creating power vacuums, whether it's in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, or in South China Sea. So the problem here is that smaller countries who are looking up to the United States for either direct protection or essentially economic or military support, they will be essentially forced to change their foreign policy towards bigger actors such as Iran, Russia, or China. So that will be creating power vacuums in various parts of the supercontinent. So essentially, we might be seeing not an aberration in the US foreign policy, but major shift where the United States will be demanding from its allies to fund their own militaries, to try to defend themselves with a bit of American support, but not entirely dependent on the US as it has been the case for the past decades. And this will be a major shift in how Washington approaches its allies and partners. So this retrenchment, or some might call it an isolationism, this actually is very much characteristic of the US foreign policy. Obviously, over the past decades, we haven't really seen cases of US retrenchment. Maybe Trump's first presidency was very much indicative of that potential trend, but beyond that, we haven't really seen any other cases. But we know other examples from 20th century, first part of the early 20th century, or even the 19th century, how the US can be essentially distant and can watch the rest of the world essentially burning, but maybe then, only then, returning or stepping in.